18 months to the day after she signed the buyback papers, Naomi Faust stood in the same gravel lot behind the bank's Hot Springs branch and told the loan officer no. That's where this ends. Where it starts is 900 days earlier, in a February so dry the county well ran cloudy, on 80 acres of ridge ground nobody but her family had ever wanted. The Faust place sat high on a spur of the Ouachita Mountains. Thin red soil stretched over quartz-veined rock that had broken 3 generations of plow blades and grown exactly one crop worth mentioning: rocks. Naomi's father used to joke that God had run out of topsoil by the time he got to their hillside and just poured gravel over the gap. In spring the ridge bloomed anyway. Thin stands of little bluestem and blackjack oak clinging to outcrops too shallow to hold a fence post without a star drill. And in August, the same rock that ruined every plow blade held the day's heat long after the valley floor had cooled, so that walking the fence line at dusk felt like walking past a bank of low stoves. She was 29 that February, and she'd spent every one of those years learning the ground the hard way, splitting fence rail by hand at her father's elbow before she was tall enough to see over the sawhorse, then later keeping her own tally of hard days scratched in chalk on the inside of the barn door, a habit she'd never once explained to anyone who asked. The loan had gone bad the way these things usually go bad, slowly and then all at once. 2 drought years back to back, a cattle market that fell out from under them, an operating note at the bank that Naomi's father had signed before his heart gave out and left her holding both the debt and the deed. When the bank foreclosed, their own appraiser walked the property in 20 minutes and wrote 3 words on his report that Naomi would never forget: negligible resale value, rock-thin cover, no irrigation potential, no road frontage worth the name. The bank didn't want 80 acres of that. They wanted their loan balance cleared off the books, and a worthless asset was worse than no asset at all. So they sold it back to her. $2,200, cash, to close the file and be done with it, with one clause buried on the second-to-last page that nobody in that lawyer's office bothered to explain out loud. A reversion right, good for 18 months, letting the bank reclaim the property at the same sale price if any mineral, timber, or mining value was discovered on it before the window closed. Naomi signed without reading past the payment terms. Why would she? It was rock. It had always been rock. Her older brother Colton thought she was a fool for fighting to keep it at all. "You're $2,200 poorer and no better off," he told her at the kitchen table, the week the papers cleared, chasing ground that never once paid for itself in Daddy's whole life. Naomi didn't argue. She just kept her chalk tally going on the barn door, 1 mark for every day she woke up still owning the place outright, and let Colton think what he wanted. If you've ever watched somebody hang on to something everyone else had already given up on, stay close for this next part, because 6 months into that 18-month window, a truck with out-of-state plates turned up at the end of the Faust driveway, and nothing about the ground under that hillside stayed simple again. The man driving it introduced himself as a landman, working ahead of a survey crew for a materials company scouting the Ouachitas for high-purity quartz deposits, the same rare, tight-grained rock that had made this stretch of Arkansas famous a century earlier for its whetstones. Back when peddlers carried Ouachita novaculite stones to hardware stores clear across the country, and that a new generation of buyers wanted for entirely different reasons, from specialty glass to industrial abrasives, to the frac sand market feeding wells 3 states away. He asked permission to walk the ridge, and Naomi watched him for the better part of an afternoon, chipping samples into small canvas bags, photographing the exposed rock face at the north fence line, saying almost nothing until he left. More curious than hopeful, she'd said yes to all of it without expecting much to come of it. 3 weeks later he came back with different news, laid out across the hood of his truck on a topographic map marked in a dozen places with grease pencil. The vein running under the Faust hillside wasn't a stray outcrop. It was thick, continuous, and unusually clean, running the full 80 acres end to end. Exactly the kind of deposit a materials company would pay real money to lease, he told her. The kind most landowners in this county would never see in a lifetime of walking their own fence lines. Naomi sat on her porch step that evening, doing the same kind of math Colton had mocked her for refusing to do, and for the first time in 2 years, the number came out in her favor. She didn't tell the bank. Why would she volunteer it? But paperwork has a way of finding its way home. The materials company's own survey filings were public record, and 11 months into the reversion window, someone at the bank's regional office noticed a familiar parcel number on a mineral lease application. The letter came by certified mail, and it didn't ask permission. It informed Naomi that the bank intended to exercise its reversion right at the original sale price before the 18-month window closed. Whatever you're picturing right now for how a bank tries to take back land it once called worthless, hold that thought, because Naomi wasn't finished reading, and the letter wasn't finished either. Buried in the same paragraph was a second clause even the bank's own officer hadn't caught the first time through. The reversion right expired, not on the sale date plus 18 months, but on the date of confirmed discovery, whichever came first. And confirmed discovery, under the contract's own definition, meant a completed filed assay report, not a landman's visit or a filing for a lease application. The survey had happened. The lease application existed, but the assay itself, the lab work proving the deposit's purity and value, hadn't been filed yet and wouldn't be for another 6 weeks. 6 weeks became the real countdown now, tighter than the 18 months ever had been. If the assay filed before the deadline, the bank's reversion clause stood untouched, and they could take the land back at $2,200 regardless. If it filed after, the window would have already closed on the reversion right entirely, discovery or not, and the land would be hers outright, quartz vein and all. Colton, who'd spent 2 years telling her the ground was worthless, was the one who ended up driving 4 hours to the materials company's regional office to ask, plainly, when the paperwork would clear, because Naomi couldn't ask without tipping the bank off to exactly how close the deadline was, and Colton, skeptic that he'd been the whole time, was the only person she trusted not to flinch under a stranger's questions. He came back with an answer that split the difference in the worst possible way. The assay was finished, sitting in a lab office 200 miles away, and would be formally filed with the state on a date 4 days after the reversion window closed. 4 days. Naomi kept marking the barn door every morning of that final stretch, chalk dust collecting on the sill below it, the tally running longer than it ever had, past 400 marks and still climbing. She stopped answering the bank's calls, not because she had anything to hide from them exactly, but because every conversation was a chance to say something that gave the 6-week gap away, and 4 days felt too thin a margin to risk on small talk. Colton took to sitting on the porch with her most evenings that week, neither of them saying much, both of them watching the road for a truck that never came. On the morning the 18-month window finally closed, she drove to the Hot Springs branch before they'd finished unlocking the doors, deed and closing letter both in hand, half expecting someone to stop her in the parking lot with a piece of paperwork that changed everything. The loan officer waiting for her wasn't unkind about it. He'd pulled the file himself and found the same 6-week gap Naomi had found, and admitted, almost embarrassed, that the bank's own boilerplate contract language had beaten the bank at its own math. 18 months, he said, sliding the closed file back across the counter. And it looks like you made it by 4 days. Naomi didn't gloat. She signed where he pointed, thanked him, and drove home to erase the tally on the barn door, all 400 and some days of it, leaving just one new mark for the morning it finally didn't matter anymore. She never leased the quartz to the materials company that made the first offer. She's still deciding, a year on, whether to lease it at all, or let it sit under the ridge a little longer the way her father always had, rock and all, worth exactly what she decides it's worth, and not $1 of somebody else's appraisal.